And we can probably get going if it's okay with you, actually.
All right, yeah, let's get going. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session, adversary or collaborative. Are both approaches to labor relation effective? My name is Adam Huang. I'm a rising third-year PhD student at Cornell's IRR School, and I'm very excited to be hosting this section. So here's the game plan. We have two presenters, and they will each get around 15 minutes, and that will be followed by Professor Rebecca Given, who will provide a discussion for us. And the remaining 20 minutes, we will spend it on Q&A sections. Okay, let's get started. So our first presenter is Johnny Callis. Johnny is a rising fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Labor Relation, Law and History at Cornell University's IRR School. His research focuses on strikes and labor militancy in the United States, with a special interest in healthcare. He also serves as the director of the IRR Labor Action Tracker. I hand it over to you, Johnny.
Great, Adam, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Can everybody see this? I'm gonna assume we all can. So great. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I apologize, the sun is like, it's that time of day, it's coming down through my window and it's like all over the place here. But my name's Johnny Callis, and I'm gonna be presenting on the ILR Labor Action Tracker. I'm leading this project, but also working with Eli Friedman, who's a professor at the ILR school, and Dana Trentelange, who's a now former graduate student in the master's program at the ILR school. I also want to give a special thanks to Dean Alex Colvin for providing generous funding that has helped make this project a reality. We just launched this project on May 1st, but we're still looking for ways to improve, so feedback is most welcome. And the genesis for this project is a considerable limitation in US strike and labor protest data, and I'll get into that right now. So I argue that existing data sources leave labor scholars, practitioners, and the general public misinformed about the true level of labor unrest here in the US. There is a general understanding that strike activity has declined since the mid-1970s, but the last 2 or 3 years are much less clear. For example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is often viewed as sort of a dominant source of strike activity here in the United States. However, the BLS only captures work stoppages that involve 1,000 or more workers and last at least an entire shift, leaving out the vast majority of strike activity. And I should say, we're definitely not the first sort of strike or labor protest tracker. There's been several of these around the world. We draw special inspiration from the China Labor Bulletin, which has tracked strikes and collective action by workers in China for the better part of the past decade. Some of you may also be familiar with Payday Report's US COVID-19 strike wave tracker. I think our project is quite different from theirs, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But ultimately, our project is how do we more effectively sort of capture labor strike and labor protest activity here in the US. And to talk through that, I'm going to discuss sort of our two-part methodology. First, how do we define a strike? And second, how do we decide to add an event to our tracker? And I should mention that we're tracking strikes and labor protests. We're not currently tracking lockouts. This is something we might do in the near future, but I just wanted to mention that at the outset. So in terms of definition, as I said, we make this distinction between strike and labor protest. I'm going to read out and explain the definitions a little bit. For a strike, we define as a temporary stoppage of work by a group of workers in order to express a grievance or enforce a demand. Such a grievance or demand may or may not be workplace related. This is heavily influenced by a definition developed by Peterson, who was a BLS official back in the 1930s. In contrast, our definition of a labor protest is a collective action by a group of people as workers, but without withdrawing their labor in order to express a grievance or enforce a demand. Such a grievance or demand may or may not be workplace related. As you can probably tell, the sort of main distinction here is whether a temporary stoppage of work led by a group of workers occurred as part of the action, in terms of whether we're defining something, an event, as a strike or a labor protest. And I want to make it clear, we're not trying to privilege one form of protest or action over another by making this distinction. We just think that stopping work is categorically different than having a rally or a picket or some other form of protest, and we wanted to sort of express that in our data set. Sometimes this is pretty clear, the distinction, but sometimes we have cases that are quite tricky. So I just want to give a couple of examples of some actions we've seen over the past year that might not seem clear cut, and how we're sort of thinking through them when we confront these examples. So the first example I want to talk through, this is now almost a year old, but last August, in response to the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, NBA and WNBA players, as you all may remember, decided to stop playing playoff games. This was widely reported in the sort of popular press as a boycott. However, we would clearly label this as a strike under our definitions. This was a group of workers stopping work in order to advance a grievance or express a demand. Some people may not consider the demand to be a traditional workplace issue, but that's irrelevant according to our definitions. It would clearly fall as a strike in our tracker. The other example I want to quickly walk through, and probably our trickiest case, frankly, are some of the actions associated with the Fight for 15 campaign. The Fight for 15, looking to raise the minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour and win union rights for low-wage workers, often holds several national days of action each year, which involve a group, kind of like you see in the picture here, of workers and community allies protesting outside of McDonald's or other fast food chains in several cities across the US and now internationally. It can be really hard, though, even though these events are generally referred to as strikes, to demonstrate whether a stoppage of work occurred. So if we can demonstrate that a stoppage of work occurred as part of these events, we do label them as strikes. The majority of these events we've labeled as protests because we just haven't been able to convincingly do that, but very happy to hear feedback on Fight for 15 or other sort of tricky cases. I talked a little bit here about the distinction between a strike and a labor protest. We also make a distinction that I don't have time, but I can in the Q&A talk about between what's a labor protest versus a non-labor protest. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. So that's sort of talking through a little bit our definitions. Now I want to move quickly how we add an event to our tracker. And to do that, we have sort of a verification protocol system around 3 different tiers of sources and associated protocols with each tier. The first tier are sources that already track work stoppage data, BLS, FMCS, Bloomberg Law. If we see an event in one of these databases, we feel comfortable automatically adding it to our tracker. So those are tier 1 sources. Tier 2 sources are where the majority right now of our events come from. This is mostly sort of typical news sources you'll find online. So this could be anything from newspaper articles like in the New York Times to NBC or CBS local news affiliates to local newspapers like the Buffalo News or the Ithaca Voice. This also includes other sort of labor journals or articles such as from labor notes or even union press releases. In order to add an event from a tier 2 source, we would need to verify it with an additional tier 2 or tier 3 source to verify that the event happened and to capture data regarding our variables that I'll get to in a second. Tier 3 sources are sort of non-traditional sources. This is mostly social media posts, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit posts. We don't want to get to a point where we're adding an event to our tracker based on a single tweet. We always try and verify a tier 3 source with an additional tier 2 source. We do also understand that some actions are not necessarily covered by the traditional press. So we will add an event to our tracker with 2 tier 3 sources, but our preference is to always find a tier 2 source to verify that. Hopefully that wasn't too complicated, but just talking through what I think are somewhat rigorous verification protocols that we're employing right now. This is a list of variables that we're also capturing data on for each event. Not all of this data is not always available for each event, but we've been surprised we're able to capture a lot of it. I should also mention on the interactive map, which you can view, you're able to filter according to some of these variables. So for example, if you wanted to see all of the strikes in the healthcare industry in which a central demand of the strike was related to COVID-19 protocols, seems pretty important right now, you're able to do that on our interactive map. But here's a list of variables we're capturing data on. And this is normally, I did this presentation a few times in the spring. I would normally interact with the map now with you all, but this is now publicly available since we launched in early May. Cool, thanks, Adam. So I'm not going to do that. I'm happy to interact with the map when we get to the Q&A. And I just want to draw your attention to, we have links to our methodology and our report a strike or protest buttons on the map itself if you want to learn more about our project there. Really quick, I want to get to some very sort of basic numbers, I guess you could say descriptive statistics maybe, on the amount of strike activity from March to May in 2021 when our data are most reliable. It's difficult to provide analysis based on these numbers as we've only kept track of strike activity for so long and it's a new database, but hopefully it's helpful nonetheless. This chart that you see here only covers strikes that began on or after January 1st, 2021, as it can be difficult to determine whether some longer duration strikes have ended or not. And it's also, you know, a single strike could occur in multiple months if it was ongoing in multiple months. For example, some of you may know the steelworkers have been on strike at several ATI facilities since late March. That strike would appear in March, April, and May on this chart right here. So in terms of what we've captured with the ILR Labor Action Tracker, 20 strikes in March, 28 in April, 30 in May. We may add a couple more that we're trying to get additional sources, and 60 overall. I hope it becomes clear just by this that the BLS should not be used really as a measure of strike activity more broadly. It's a measure of large strike activity, I should say. But you know, they're capturing a small fraction of the amount of strikes that are occurring. Bloomberg does a much better job at tracking work stoppages, but they do have some limitations, at least that we've noticed, in terms of short duration strikes and also strikes by non-union workers. And while they do a better job, we've tracked in just 3 months almost double the amount of total strikes as Bloomberg has. And I know that Becky, Justin, and I have a specific interest in the healthcare and education sectors. So it's hard, you know, these numbers don't mean a lot without much of a comparison, but we've tracked 5 strikes in healthcare over the past 3 months and 13 strikes in education in this time frame. And I should say neither of these databases track labor protest activity. So we found 63 labor protests in April and 68 in May. That's in addition to the strike activity you see here. We're not really trying to get an accurate count of protests. We are with strikes. There's a ton of labor protest activity happening daily in the United States. We're just trying to sort of paint a picture of that. Just the last sort of substantive slide. Because we just launched this project, we really don't have much analysis to present, but I do want to show I caution this a little bit, a not so rigorous historical comparison to give a basic sense of strike activity in the present period. So the BLS actually kept track of all work stoppages involving 6 or more employees until funding cuts by the Reagan administration in 1982. And you can get this data online fairly easy. Across the 1970s, during the month of April, there were an average of 821 work stoppages. That's both strikes and lockouts tracked by the BLS during the month of April in the 1970s. This is obviously considerably larger than the 28 strikes that we captured this past April. If we included lockouts, it'd be a few more, but not a significant number. And I think this speaks to the immense difficulties workers face organizing and striking today. And then just in conclusion, we hope this provides a useful tool for activists and scholars moving forward, especially this PhD student and his dissertation research, hopefully. And I think some interesting research questions could be around non-union versus union walkouts, short duration or pre-authorized strikes, and also analyzing data on labor protests. I'm not aware of any sort of database on labor protest activity, so hopefully we can make that contribution as well. And then finally, feel free to visit the website at that URL there, and in some shameless project promotion, you can follow us on Twitter at the handle there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Johnny, for the excellent presentation. I think we can save all the questions to the Q&A section. So for our next presentation, we have Justin Vinton. Justin is a PhD candidate in Industrial Relations and Human Resources at Rogers School of Management and Labor Relations. He studies labor and employment relations, management, and organizational structure, which includes the topics of labor management partnership, multi-level collaborative work arrangements, and the changing role of middle management. His primary research focuses on the sectors of public education and healthcare. He also has a second string of research examining skill development and VET in Europe and the US. And I hand it to you, Justin.
Great, thanks, Adam. And super interesting work, Johnny. I'm excited to see that move on. Can everyone see my screen now? Yeah. Okay, great. So taking kind of a different approach and more of a micro level, I'm going to take you within an organization. So this is some of my master's thesis work a couple years ago that I've been building on. And it revolves around collaboration and partnership within public education in New Jersey. So what kind of just to preface, a lot of the work that I've seen in the literature revolves around organization or unit level partnership, and kind of looking at either the unit being like a school or the organization being a district for what I'm looking at. And I'm looking at the interaction between those different levels. I think this multi-level approach and this bottom-up approach, looking specifically at how maybe unit level collaboration and partnership can influence upper level decision-making and collaboration as well. So just a kind of a background, I want to give a definition of collaborative work structure designed to provide opportunities for employees to actively participate through their union in decision-making management throughout the whole entire organization. So again, that's that multi-level aspect. And just to say that there's numerous studies in various industries that show there's positive organizational outcomes and performance, as well as positive employee outcomes and lower turnover and commitment and other things like that. So, but there's issues with these types of collaborative organizations, even beyond partnership. They're very complex and require multiple kinds of roles, especially if you're involving a union, which you have to balance between traditional bread and butter issues like collective bargaining and actual changing a role to collaborate with management, and the same for vice versa. So there's varying degrees of partnership effectiveness throughout levels of the organization that we see. So questions of like, do actors within a unit or organization effectively collaborate around important decisions or not? Like what are these important decisions that they're collaborating around? For example, in education, are they collaborating around, walking, how students walk in the hallways, or are they collaborating around like teaching and learning issues? And this relates to sustainability, because there's always a potential for partnership and collaboration to revert to a traditional organizational structure, which does happen. But why is another question. There's the common question in the literature. What are the conditions for an effective and sustainable multi-level partnership with the whole entire organization? And again, this goes for collaborative organizations in general. But my key questions are, at what level are these conditions, and what role do the lower and middle level of the organization play, as including the actors in those units? So at the school level, I'm mainly looking at union representatives, teachers, and principals. So and I have another question of, can these lower and middle level processes still be effective despite the lack of upper levels partnership support and resources from the union or management, which you do see. So most partnership research is done at the organization or unit level. And there's a large focus on importance of upper level support, because usually these are top-down decisions that are being made. So it's top level organizations saying we want to adopt this type of collaborative structure. But in complex organizations, partnerships is an inherently multi-level phenomenon. So sometimes when an organization is adopting this type of system, they don't necessarily get the input from other stakeholders at lower levels of the organization. And less is known about the interaction between levels of partnership and the impact on partnership effectiveness and their outcomes. So how these unit versus organizational or strategic level interactions happen, and what effects can be bottom up. So from the unit level, or middle out. I'm still kind of thinking about whether it's more of a bottom up or middle out process. So maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A more. So, but the research shows that we need emphasis on the process and roles of collaboration. There's a dearth of partnership research in this to address this type of complexity and nuance. I'll just give one quote here. Stewart and Martinez-Lucio argue strategic partnership is not just about outcomes with potential for trade unions. Rather, partnership raises broader questions about the regulation of employment relations, the way practices and processes are played out and by whom, and not just its outcomes. So again, this process is very important, and we've seen it in IR literature and the HRM literature that there's always these types of things that are not always focused on, because a lot of times we look at outcomes that you'd think of, like student performance, which are obviously important, but we need to figure out what processes work to get to that end as well. There has been research, I'm not going to go through all of it, that does look at this, But despite these studies on the complex nature of partnership relations within and across organizations, across numerous industries, we still need a clearer multi-level perspective to examine these complex structures and processes that can make partnership and collaboration work within an organization. And again, I'm offering this bottom-up or middle-out perspective. Why is this important? I think we have issues of, there's always the issue of why don't more organizations adopt collaborative structures? And what role do managers and employees interact throughout all of the levels of the organization? So what specific structures and processes produce these collaborative decision-making procedures, and at what level do they occur, and do they have the potential to sustain? Because there's always the possibility to revert back to normal, hierarchical decision-making top-down. And there's a normative aspect to this, which is part of the IR tradition. How can they be better? How can they work better for the benefit of employees as well as the organization? And there's also a critical aspect to this, which is part of the labor process theory. Are these collaborative organizations effective or even worthwhile and sustainable for employees as well as middle management? Because sometimes you hear a lot about pseudo collaboration where management really doesn't want to collaborate with the union, or they're kind of just saving face to, work with, teachers, for example, but not really have use their input to actually make decisions, and they already have an idea of what they want to do. So the study I'm presenting now, this is data I collected for my master's thesis, is from, I had in-depth access to 14 schools, which are the units across 4 districts, the organizations in New Jersey. This is part of what Saul Rubenstein, my colleague, and Charles Heckscher have. This is school districts that are participating in labor management consortium of over 25 districts, where they're getting trained essentially to learn how to do this type of model and adopt partnership. They see the research that it's good for student performance, and they want to, use this type of system to complement their traditional hierarchy and kind of change it. In almost all cases, the adoption of this partnership was a top-down decision made by the superintendent or union district leadership with little to no input from other lower level stakeholders. This varies a little bit. Most of the time, teachers or principals were not a part of deciding that this would be the way that we do things. And the impetus for adoption across districts and schools varied. Some were in more or less crises, most weren't, and just saw the data on student performance and wanted to, pursue this type of collaboration. So I did interviews over about a year with teachers, union leaders, and rank and file members, principals, and other district and school level administration, which is about a total 51 educators in semi-structured interviews or focus groups. I also did a survey of 10 partnership facilitators. Facilitators are part of the school district members that were the first ones to do this type of partnership, and they became kind of facilitators and trainers for other districts that were interested in doing this. So I asked them, and they have very close access to the 3 districts, to the districts that, the 4 districts, sorry, that I have collected data on. So just to kind of give a structure, and I'm talking about, again, this multi-level aspect, there's the school leadership team, which is made up of the principal co-lead and a union leader co-lead in the building. And then there's other staff that they agree upon to have in these meetings, which happen, a couple times a month, or, every other month, which can vary. And then there's the district leadership team, which usually has the principal from the SLT, the union member from each SLT, a superintendent, and then the curriculum directors and supervisors. So there's all of these stakeholders involved, and the idea is for them to communicate with each other. So from the school leadership team, one member or a handful of members are on the district leadership team, and vice versa. So there's this kind of collaboration from one level to the other, or at least communication. And I also use qualitative comparative analysis, QCA. If time, we can discuss more about this. Essentially, it's a set theoretic method that looks at configurations and necessary and sufficient conditions to get to a certain outcome. I won't use up too much time to explain this, but if you do have questions on what that is, I'm happy to talk more about that after the presentation. But ideally, it's great for, it mixes qualitative and quantitative, and it's ideal for small to medium N sizes. And I have an N of 14 schools, so that's perfect. And there's 5 main conditions for an effective school level partnership. This is what I found from the interview data I collected, and as well as from the survey from the 10 facilitators. So at the district level, central office support was very important. District level union support was obviously important. And the school level conditions were working relationship between principal and school, the school union leader, as well as a principal willingness to adapt, as well as school level structure and process quality. So a properly functioning school leadership team. So the outcome I'm looking here, and this is, again, came from the data, the interview data, as well as the facilitators who are very familiar with these 14 schools because they were facilitating this type of collaboration and interaction and training, is effective school partnership. Or so whether you have an effective school partnership or an ineffective school partnership, that dependent variable is an issue which I can talk about afterwards, but that's essentially what I have right now. So here you can see there's district level conditions, which I just discussed. And here you can see the school level conditions. So the two configurations I want to look at are 1 and 7. So of all of the, there's 4 schools that had an effective partnership with this configuration, and there were 3 in number 7 that had an effective school level partnership with this configuration. But what I want to show you here is that the district level conditions weren't always present. So in configuration 1, there were 4 schools that didn't have full central office support. They did have district level union support. And then on the other hand, in configuration 7, there were 3 schools that had central office support, but didn't have district level union support. But both of them, all 7 of these districts or these schools did have these school level conditions present that led to the outcome of effective school partnership. So one measure using QCS calls coverage, which is the percentage of instances that the outcome and the condition were present together in the same configuration. So central office support was 60%, district level union support was 70%, but the school level conditions would seem to be even more necessary and sufficient for an effective school level partnership. And those were, again, working relationship between principal and school union leader, principal willingness to adapt, and structure and process quality. So again, just kind of to interpret what this means and why this is important, I think my data show that union management support from the top of the organization are salient for lower levels during the start of partnership. Thank you, Adam. And during times of conflict, contention, or stagnation, which did play out in the interviews. So obviously it was a top-down decision. The upper level, administration and union were usually involved in that. But during times of normal partnership operation, after they may have been operating for a year or 2 or more, upper level union and management support may not both be necessary, as you saw in the QCA analysis. Only one may suffice if other unit or school level conditions are present, such as a strong principal and building relationship. So there's multiple examples of this, as I showed with the coverage measure. 7 out of the 10 effective school partnerships only had union or administrative upper level support. So this bottom-up concept and its potential effectiveness for kind of influencing decision-making throughout the entire organization, data show that these lower conditions may be even more important or necessary for an effective school partnership than those at the upper levels of the organization. And they may endure and even kind of stick at the lower levels despite the lack of upper level strategic support. And there's anecdotal evidence, I think, that they can even influence upper level processes and decision-making. So I guess more broadly, can lower level partnership effectiveness be beneficial to the upper levels and the entire organization? So if a unit or school partnership structure and their processes, like I mentioned, the school leadership teams are already in place and functioning, they may stick there and operate effectively, which is good because we know that that type of lower level collaboration and those structures can lead to positive student outcomes, which is what we really are interested in as teaching and learning and education. And this may be despite what potentially common changes take place at upper levels of the organization. So in my data, there was numerous times where there was leadership turnover or dwindling support or resources for partnership and collaboration across organization, or a superintendent or district administration not really knowing what's going on at the school level with the SLTs, but they were still being effective and successful. So if these unit level structures and processes can stick down low, can they then shift upward? And I think there is some anecdotal evidence suggesting they can, where a school leadership team actually influenced how a district leadership team operated. because of the district saw how effective it was going. So there's theoretical and practical implications to this. I think it adds some complexity to the current research, saying that top-level leadership is necessary for an effective partnership. I'm not saying that that isn't the case. It still very much may be. But these data do show that these higher level conditions may be sufficient, but maybe not as necessary as the lower level school structural, procedural, and relational conditions, which are specifically looking at those that involve the principal in facilitating partnership and boundary spanning the system. And these findings suggest a bottom up or a middle out. Again, as I mentioned, I'm not sure which to term this, but approaches to partnership may be appropriate and even stick at the lower levels of the organization. There's also a labor process aspect to it, which is what I mentioned before. Is there a potential for employees and middle managers to, at the unit level, to influence upper level organizational structures and processes, and is that sustainable? So that's kind of my project that I wanted to present here today. That's my study. But to take a step back and to kind of combine with what Johnny's doing with Strike Tracker, which is great. So we have this kind of and this is where I think Becky Given can come in, because she's very adept in both partnership and collaboration, as well as more militant strikes. So we're looking at collaborative and adversarial labor relations and an opportunity for compatibility within U.S. public education. And for context, you can see the Becky's book with Amy Schrenger-Lang that talks about. Thank you, Adam. That talks about strike for the common good and the teacher and resident strikes in public education that have been happening for the past decade, even more recently, the Red for Ed wildcat strikes. In 2018, this is from a chapter in this book. In 2018, there were 20 major work stoppages involving around 485,000 workers, most strikers any year since 1986, and 70% of those strikers were teachers, whether it was wildcat or otherwise. I also want to insert a plug for the strike tracker here for Johnny, because he told us the issues with the BLS statistics, so take that for what it is. So there's these strikes happening, but there's also, the NEA just provided significant funding to work with the NJEA, their New Jersey affiliate on building this capacity for partnership. And labor management partnership has been happening in public school districts across the country. The AFT has also dedicated funds to large California school district to support this work. So in one industry, there's these two types of, labor relations happening, which is interesting to me. I think it makes sense, but I think we need to tease out the complexity and why that is and how that happens and what the potential for compatibility is. It's a dialectic issue, right? I think, how can we have both collaborative and adversarial models of labor relations in public education, and is it sustainable? What are the boundary conditions? Are these models compatible in the same region, like traditionally anti-union states and states without collective bargaining rights? What are the implications from Janus across the board, because it's a national decision? Even in the same union, the school or the district, what's the role of alternative labor organizations that might be even at odds with the union in certain cases? And then other external factors like elections, social unrest, austerity, race, equity, inclusion. But what I think is kind of unique and not unique, well, interesting, is that both these relations and both these approaches have similar goals, right? They both value the expertise of teachers and unions. They both want to improve school and learning conditions, student outcomes, better race, equity, and inclusion. And they both want to improve and kind of engage the community. But the targets may be different. So a lot of times, the one Red for Ed, for example, really looked at state and local governments and policymakers, and they were statewide. They weren't necessarily against a school district. So in some other cases, strikes were against a specific school district. And even in the Red for Ed, I think in Arizona, there's support beyond from the union. School and district administrators were on board with the teachers and they wore red to school. So there's kind of this interesting collaboration around like striking even for the common good. So are these two models compatible? And I think a big kind of question is what happens, and this is the last point here, what happens if and when teachers win and impact changes to legislation? Are there opportunities for pluralism and collaborative relations, or is there a revert back to the traditional kind of way of doing things? And again, what is the role of our alternative labor organizations in this? Can we leverage both models for better teacher and student outcomes? And like I said, even national level teachers unions have supported both of these types of approaches. So again, looking for the compatibility, is there room for having both within the same district even, or in the same union, and what would that look like? And again, this is kind of a broad topic that we're still developing. So Johnny and obviously Becca's going to speak now. Please feel free to, and I encourage you to kind of promote this discussion and ask more questions. But other than that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. For our next section, we have Professor Rebecca Given, who is an Associate Professor of Labor Studies and Employment Relations in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She has published widely on employment relations in healthcare, comparative welfare states, and labor studies in journals such as Social Forces, IR Review, and British Journal of Industrial Relations. I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Johnny and Justin. I have a problem, which is that those were great, stimulating presentations, and I want to stay brief because I'm sure that everyone listening has a lot to say, but I also have many thoughts, so I will try to pick and choose a little bit. I think I'll say a couple things about each of your presentations and then maybe make some overarching points. Johnny, I'm really flummoxed by what I'm always flummoxed by and intrigued about whether your tracker can help us with this. So I appreciate your distinction between labor protest and strikes, and you, I think, wisely have decided that you can have a much greater degree of certainty and accuracy around your data by sticking to strikes. But I am still thinking through where you draw the line and how you draw the line. And so I'm thinking there's many things when I think about Red for Ed that we could say are definitely actions and not strikes, like wearing red, right? If everybody's wearing red, that's not a strike, no way. But what I'm thinking about during the pandemic is things like teachers refusing to teach in person, but still teaching online, right? And in some cases, we had those Chicago teachers sitting outside their schools, right? Because they were being ordered to teach on the computer in a classroom and they said no, right? And so, but they weren't refusing to work, right? They were absolutely not withdrawing their labor. In fact, they were making their working conditions worse by sitting in their winter coats in a parking lot. So, you know, I don't want that totally out, but it's not a strike. I agree with your definition. So I guess, I don't know if I have a question about that, but I'm just wondering what we can kind of do with that, and that we might not want to throw that kind of protest out. It seems pretty significant, and especially if you're going to track events over time, you would want to know that, you know, a lot of teachers refused to teach in person and insisted on teaching on remotely. And then three years later, when the collective bargaining agreement expired, there was a strike. And, you know, if you're trying to draw out some conclusions over time, some inferences, you would kind of want to know that. So that's what I'm thinking through. I don't really quibble with your definitions. I think they're you got to draw lines, and yours are good. Justin, what I want to ask you about is just pay. So it strikes me that I want to know whether this kind of collaborative relationship is only possible if pay is not an issue or is not too much of an issue. I know that New Jersey has better teacher pay, or what we would say much smaller teacher pay penalty, thanks to Sylvia Allegretto's and others long-term tracking, right? So can you do this kind of collaboration if you're just really mad about being underpaid, right? And I'm curious about that. I don't know the answer. I sort of feel like the inherent disrespect you feel if you're just, you know, starving or working second jobs or whatever it is gonna make it hard to be collaborative. I would guess that collaboration generally, I don't know if you've tracked this, requires a good bit of more or less uncompensated time. Maybe you get a bit of time carved into maybe for some of the more leadership roles, you get some time taken off of your teaching in order to do this work. But I bet that the buy-in also involves some additional time, which you may not be able to do if you're working a second or third job. You just may be resentful. You may be able and unwilling to do it. So I'm curious about how it relates to pay. A few sort of overarching points. I appreciate you guys gave me a challenge, right, to talk about the most and least collaborative employment relations and what we could say about all of them. But I guess what I'm really thinking about is the spectrum of employee voice, from collaboration to, you know, strikes as the most extreme form of adversarial relationships. But I think we can think more about, you know, one question I have is sort of how we understand this as forms of union strength or weakness, or worker strength or weakness, right? Not all the strikes are unionized. So I think, for example, that a full-on sort of indefinite timing strike, just a walk off the job, takes union strength. But some of the other kinds of actions, or a more time-limited strike, or even something like Fight for 15, which I'm not sure how you're classifying each Fight for 15 event, because we know that in many cases those strikes, most of the people are probably more fit your definition of protest, and that they're workers not scheduled to work that day who stand outside the fast food restaurant. So I'm wondering what we think about these as sort of signs of strength or weakness of, let's say, the workers or the union, or just the strength of the voice, right? And I'm thinking the same thing we can apply to sort of long-standing industrial relations question, like, is a really grievance-heavy workplace a sign of worker strength or worker weakness, right? If all they're able to do is file grievances, but they can't ever organize for a strike, you know, maybe they're not so strong, right? Maybe, but on the other hand, they might be enforcing their contract really well, and that could be considered a real sign of strength. Another question I have is just what the impact of these kinds of relationships, whether adversarial or collaborative, are, and especially thinking about how it affects new membership and organizing. Because I can imagine, you know, I do think of myself as an organizer and some of the work I do. And I think, you know, when you're reaching out to, whether it's, you know, new employees to encourage them to join, especially we're talking about a lot of public sector, or unions doing new organizing, do you do a better job organizing if you say, we're ready to go, we're ready to walk off, we have the power lies in our ability to withdraw our labor? Or do you have a better job saying, no, unions aren't like, you know, the Flint sit-down strike, we actually collaborate, and we're all here to improve public education, and we're in it for the kids? Like, what is the impact on recruitment and organizing? So that's kind of one of the questions I have. And then the other question is just a sort of power question, which I don't know why I said just. Power questions are like the questions we can never answer. But what I really am interested in both the adversarial and the collaborative context is where the decision actually lies. And I think Justin was getting into some interesting aspects of this, talking about in the Red for Ed strikes when principals and even in some cases superintendents were in support, right? But who decides, and how is it decided when whether a relationship is more adversarial or more collaborative, right? Is it an active decision? Is it by rank and file workers? Is it by union leaders? We know with teacher strikes, in some cases like West Virginia and Arizona, the rank and file teachers, whether or not they were in an organized caucus, really pushed union leadership, who didn't particularly want to walk out, but couldn't resist the organizing done by rank and file members, right? So how does that, who has the power, and how does it shift, and how are those, how do you actually figure out whether it's going to be an adversarial or a collaborative relationship? So in the case of a formal partnership, I think you can look at, you know, who's actively making that decision, but also, is it, you know, are all the union members on board? Is there dissent? Is it well implemented? If the, let's say, union leadership is too far out in front of the membership, how does that work? So I'm wondering, and similarly with the strikes, right? Is the rank and file leading the union leadership? Is it the other way around? Is it this beautiful democratic vision of unionism where everybody's organizing together and moving in the same direction? I'm thinking about that a bit. But I think I will stop there because I want to have time to hear from others as well. But thank you for these great presentations. I really enjoyed them.
I think we can jump into the Q&A session. I think.
Johnny, do you wanna go first?
You go ahead, Justin, and then we can get into the Q&A.
Sure. So yeah, let me just pull up my notes real quick. Becky, yeah, you mentioned about pay and whether people or teachers who already get paid poorly wouldn't want to collaborate, and that does make sense, and it varies whether it's even stipulated in the contract whether they get time to engage in partnership or attend an SLT after school hours or over the summer. Even in COVID, there were a ton of meetings that happened that were part of collaboration and those structures. Some were paid, some were not. Some were some districts have a way to do that, others don't. So, and that's the districts that are in my study are wealthier districts, so the teachers are paid fairly well, at least comparatively. So that is, and there's other districts that have entered the consortium that are in higher poverty areas with lower socioeconomic status. So that's something we're definitely interested in finding out, is whether and traditionally teachers would get paid less there. So that is something that we are definitely interested in. So I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I think it's a very good one and something that needs to be addressed for sure.
Johnny?
And Becky, just really quick before we open up the Q&A, I think these short duration strikes we've seen in healthcare is an interesting way to tie some of your comments together, especially in terms of sort of worker union power and where do the decisions actually lie. Because so many of these strikes are pre-authorized, short duration, and there probably needs to be more research done on this, but I think a lot of reason is just a response to, frankly, what the Massachusetts nurses are going through right now in Worcester, which is a problem of permanent replacements. And I think even though nurses, you think of a possession that had maybe a high level of bargaining or structural power, still resorting now to these short duration strikes in almost every case that we've documented over the past 5 months, except for the Massachusetts nurses, I think is a really interesting development.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. I think Dale has a question.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. And this is a question for Johnny, and I sort of wrote this out, but he's made a point that he's arguing that his measures are substantially better than the current BLS measures. And overall, I agree with him. It's better to have more data than less, but it would be very handy if he could give us a distribution on the size of the strike, simply to say that, well, I've got 20 strikes in my data. I've got BLS has 2. Well, we know those 2 are 1,000 or more. What's the size distribution on the others? Because the degree that what you're picking up is a lot of small strikes and short duration strikes, you're providing information. I don't know how important it is. So the number of workers involved and its duration have always been important on kind of asking about what the effects are of a strike. And the other thing I was going to throw in here is that the traditional BLS way of following strikes, this is long ago and far away, but it was at least into the 1980s, was a clipping service, which you could basically replicate online. In terms of, you say the New York Times, local papers might be especially important to pick up information, and typically reporters will have the number of workers involved, and you'll be able to figure out the duration of that strike. So I think both of those are important elements in kind of making your point that this is a step forward, and you could do some comparisons between BLS, Bloomberg, and your strike tracker. It's good work. It's good work. Early days, so I'm impressed. But these are some important steps.
And if I could just respond quickly, absolutely, Dale, I totally agree. And that information data will hopefully be forthcoming. I'm not sure exactly how soon, but in terms of number of workers involved, also some more breakdowns in terms of industry, union versus non-union walkouts, et cetera. The only thing I'll say, I really think the BLS is so limited. Massachusetts nurses, 800 in Worcester, have been on strike since March 8th. The BLS doesn't capture it at all. It's almost 3 months now. It's 800 workers. 200 Oregon Tech faculty were on strike. And these are just a couple of examples. But I totally get your point, especially about these shorter duration strikes, where a strike by 6 restaurant workers in a non-union site, I'm treating the same as a strike by 3,000 Columbia graduate students. There's definitely a difference there, and I'll spell that out as we move forward with the project.
And I have to jump in and say I've been tracking teacher strikes along with Phila Townsend and some others, and the BLS, it's even worse because a few years back there was a coordinated set of strikes in suburban Seattle school districts, and each school district was quite small, so no school district had 1,000 workers, but the cumulative effect was a pretty significant strike, and it's not there. So I agree, and if anyone wants to try to influence the BLS to go back to a lower threshold, that would be great too.
I think that's basically you have a good administration for maybe moving in that direction. I mean, obviously this was a result of the Reagan administration's cutbacks and it hasn't been reversed. But I would still say, and I agree, the lower size for the BLS is basically, they took money out of that program and moved it to others. So perhaps you go to the administrator, or I forget the name of the person in charge of BLS, but you could go to them. What I'd also say is that it shouldn't be that hard to get, you know, as I said, BLS was using a clipping service. We now have the internet. So it's basically a matter of throwing bodies, maybe undergraduate bodies at this. And you really need numbers to make your point and say, what, you know, so if we ask, why is this better? Or what am I getting out of this? You got to have the number of strikers, and you need to have some measure of duration. That's hard to get at the far end because some strikes just collapse and you don't know when it formally ends. But nonetheless, those are both important measures, and you're moving forward with this. So I hope you pay attention to both.
Feel free to also just type in the chat box if it's easier.
I guess I'll jump in and just say, I think another interesting thing to think about, if either of you is doing some sort of following over time of particular, workplaces, is the transition from collaborative to adversarial and back again, right? So those of us, and Justin knows this well, who've looked a lot at partnership, know that a lot of partnerships grew out of massive strife and strikes in some cases, right? So they sort of, after years and years of strikes, or the ritual of going on strike every time the bargaining agreement expired, in some hospitals especially, there was a decision to move to partnership. And so it'd be interesting. You could imagine an argument where you say, strike is the ultimate union strength, and when the union is strong enough, they're able to have a well-functioning partnership, and that is something that's sort of worth understanding how that takes shape over time.
Yeah, Becky, that's and at that point you just made kind of brings back another point you made about like the spectrum of there's collaborative on one end, and then on the completely on the other there's the militant, and there is like so I can foresee, like, even conceptually you can kind of create this spectrum, but also with a tracker with data from collaborative school districts, you can kind of place them on that or something. So I don't know, Johnny, maybe we can talk about that after, but I think that's a pretty cool idea and would be pretty useful.
I think Zachary have a comment, and we'll go to Dell afterwards.
Hi, sorry, my video is not on, but appreciate the ones on the, and it's been a great discussion. I appreciate Justin. I'm someone who I've led some strikes in healthcare, and I've led partnerships or tried to lead partnerships in healthcare. And I just wonder, so I appreciate Justin's research, really thinking about the variables that make it succeed, both kind of top level sponsorship is how I think of it, and then kind of at the point of care work in healthcare. So I'm going to be thinking about what I see based on that interaction, and I would just say anecdotally, I think it tracks what I'm hearing from Justin. The question that I would pose is how would this look across different industries? Because higher level in healthcare these days is very large scale, very corporatized. And I think that's different in education. I'm not an expert, but that was just one difference that I was thinking about, that money and decision-making is really centralized, and there's a lot of chains to get through in healthcare. So without that top level support, it becomes pretty hard to sustain partnership, is a comment. So I don't know if anybody, curious to hear others' experience from other industries, or just that point about the applicability of those lessons to other settings.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm thinking just, again, anecdotally, that, money probably influences healthcare, at least like a corporation style, more than an education, although, tax funding and boards do as well, which are kind of the corporate, I guess, entities there. But yeah, I mean, that's the concern though, right? But what I think I'm finding, and I assume this could happen in healthcare as well, is that, I'm talking to a principal or a school union leader, just rank and file teacher, and they're saying, partnership's great, collaboration at the school level is great. We don't really have to deal with the district. They don't know what's going on. They don't want to, and that's kind of where this is like, we're still, having meetings, and no one above us at the higher level has any idea of what happens. And I might be, exaggerating to a point, but that's essentially what is going on. So yeah, but I'd never really thought about the different types of industry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do see that in a couple of hospitals where it's like they're continuing, even though they've lost some of that top level support. Right. They had to get started, but they're continuing. And so to me, it's maybe a question of how far can they go? Because I was talking with someone the other day, and they're getting good outcomes on their unit-based teams, but we did all this work and we want to buy some new equipment, but that has to go so high up chains of command now in healthcare, and these health systems are so large. So anyway, maybe it's not that different in education. I'm not as familiar with.
No, it's a great question. It's something I really haven't thought about, like the funding issue, and this kind of gets back to, I guess, Becky's point about pay as well. But yeah, I'm thinking though, just from reflecting quickly on your point, is there's certain things that you're probably not gonna be able to address, especially financially, if you do need new equipment or something. That's difficult to do without upper level support, right? So there is definitely like a confined nature of decision making that's available, I think, which is something I think you have to think more about, actually. But thank you for that point. That's really helpful.
Dale, you have a comment? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, I'll keep them brief. One is that a number of the cases which Rebecca brought up, where there were strikes that were very large scale, were also in the public sector, and those were in states where strikes were entirely illegal. So this is almost a throwback to the public sector prior to the passage of laws in other states where there's a strike ban, and that went forward from there, and you tend to have large strikes. The '69 Postal Service strike was very similar. So that's one reason why frequently unions aren't directly involved in that, because of the size of the fines and the effect of the unions as institutions. But if you go ahead and strike and the union isn't there saying, yes, we're supporting this strike, you're in a much stronger position. So I don't know how much that applied to any of those cases. I know in Kansas it was illegal, or maybe it was Oklahoma. Anyway, and Arizona. Last thing, and this is for Justin, there is a lot of labor management cooperative activity in construction. In fact, it's probably more deeply embedded in construction than it is anywhere else. That's significantly because there are a lot of outside pressure from the open shop, and there's nothing that underlies serious collaboration better than having a well-defined enemy that's outside of things. So for example, they have a number of unions have various procedures, the United Association, the electrical workers, a number of procedures, so that you basically have to take your strike issues to a bipartite council. And they listen to your case, both sides get 15 minutes to make their case, go behind closed doors, a decision is made. They basically don't allow strikes, except, why? Because that hurts all of union construction, and non-union construction is perfectly happy to waddle in and say that, you can't trust those union constructors. So you might want to take a look at that, because that gives you a different set of pressures to look at.
Yeah, that's a
I'd
great.
be happy to facilitate that.
Yeah, I'll reach out to you offline. Yeah. That sounds great. I appreciate that. That's helpful.
All right. Unless anyone have any final comments, I think we can end here. I want to thank everyone for coming to this section, and I think I actually learned a lot from the presentations and the discussion. And enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Adam, for organizing.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, War. Nice to see you.
Adam, thanks so much. We'll talk.
Yeah, thanks,
No
Adam.
problem.
With the light across your face, you look a little Sith-like at times.
Johnny, you need a hood. Johnny and Adam, if you guys want to meet over the next couple of days to discuss more about, what next steps or what we want to do involving the latter part of the presentation, I'm happy to do that, or not, or we can wait until after later.
Yeah, cool. Let's we'll find some time. But thanks, Justin. Thanks, Adam again. And
Yeah,
I'm gonna go get some ice cream. I'll talk to you later.
Enjoy. See you guys.
Enjoy, guys. Bye.